Thank you. Okay, everyone. I hope this is going to work. So my name is Radek Łukasiewicz, and today I will present my research project titled Lettering as a Form of Expression in the Culture of Shortages. This research is conducted at the doctoral school of the Eugeniusz Geppert Academy of Art and Design in Wrocław. Writing systems do not evolve in isolation. Under communist shortages, book cover lettering in Poland developed into a distinct convention-forming practice where graphic language, cultural expression, and constraints negotiation coincided. This lettering has not been systematically studied as a practice shaped by material scarcity and ideology. Existing scholarship tends to focus on posters, typefaces, or isolated examples rather than mapping conventions across a larger body of work. This practice-based research used historical investigation as a foundation for creating a series of typefaces based on observed vernacular conventions, translating these shared visual characteristics into contemporary digital typefaces that can serve as a tool for both design and practice and education. As this is an ongoing project, this presentation focuses on the theoretical framework of this investigation, focusing on Polish People Republic period from 1945 to 1989. Post-war Poland emerged from the Second World War in a state of massive material and cultural destruction. The rebuilding of cities, industries, and infrastructure placed enormous pressure on the economy, while the centrally planned system struggled to meet even basic consumer needs. Chronic shortages of fuel, food, clothing, and everyday goods became a defining feature of life under communism. Moreover, it naturally motivated the do-it-yourself approach as the cultural quality of social life. The printing industry was equally affected. Wartime destruction has severely reduced printing infrastructure, creating long-term shortages of paper, metal type, inks, and machinery. In later decades, strict state regulations and limited import of Western printing equipment further restricted typographic variety. The chronic lack of resources limited what could be done graphically with type, especially at larger sizes. This scarcity directly affected how text could physically appear in print. At the same time, strict state control over the printing industry weakened the crucial relationship between designer and printer, reducing autonomy within the production process. As type choices were severely limited, designers tend to hand lettering, which operated outside the industrial typesetting processes, offered greater flexibility, and remained abstract enough to pass censorship. The boundaries that define where lettering happens can be blurry. However, practically, type has to fit into a repetitive system of boxes where lettering does not. This seemingly simple distinction is crucial for this research. The communist system's mission to revolutionize the nation culturally served a dual purpose, expanding literacy while scaling book production in service of ideology. The result was a condition of friction, scarce resources set against relentless demands for output, forcing creativity to constantly negotiate the final visual outcome. This research locates its subject within that friction. Designers could not simply execute, they had to negotiate between ideological demands and material reality. It is through this coercion, rather than despite it, that expression emerged. The conventions born from this environment were shaped by education and codified working methods. both themselves instruments of the system. Censorship exercised strict control over publishing in Communist Poland, but its operation was far from uniform. What was approved often depended not only on central regulations, but also on the judgment of individual censors. This unpredictability shaped the production process itself, forcing publishers to develop internal mechanisms for self-regulation before submitting work for state approval. The system was rigid in theory, but unstable in practice. Not all sectors were controlled equally. Areas such as theater, cinema, and circus often allowed greater visual freedom, particularly when foreign production had already been approved for distribution. These pre-cleared cultural imports created spaces for experimentation, accelerating poster design to one of the most dynamic fields of the period. Book publishing, however, remained much more closely tied to ideology, education, and cultural policy, reducing opportunities for overt experimentation. In this context, lettering became one of the few flexible and relatively low-risk forms of visual expression. It allowed designers to negotiate individuality within a regulated system. Traditional design scholarship has largely focused on mass-produced typefaces, which were relatively scarce in 20th century Poland, leaving hand lettering largely unexamined in a systematic way. By shifting attention to more ephemeral materials, this research uncovered a rich source of letter forms knowledge that remain relevant for contemporary practice. As a result of massive influx of books, covers had to compete visually in a crowded market, and their lettering actively shaped the graphic landscape for decades, and it's still visible on shelves today. The project used a mixed method approach. Archival analysis, later complemented by interviews and typeface design. It allows four main steps: broad corpus, curated subset, detailed analysis, and synthesis. This research began with gathering a broad selection of book covers that use lettering in their design. The covers were captured as screenshots from online resources such as auction portals, digital marketplaces. This phase was informed by a review of existing literature on book and graphic design in Poland. To date, the datasets include around 3,000 book cover screenshots representing nearly 40 publishing houses. This broad corpus establishes the visual field from which recurring conventions can be observed. The broad dataset is then filtered through qualitative selection. At this stage, I focused on aspects such as proportions, consistency, economy of reused forms, and originality. Selected covers are physically sourced and scanned in high resolution, and additional metadata, including designer, publisher, year, typeface used for the body copy, and dimensions, is collected to improve analysis and searchability. What often attracts attention are details that intentionally stretch or break established rules of letter construction. Because these decisions appear repeatedly and systematically, they cannot be dismissed as accidents. They signal meaningful stylistic strategies. This stage links recurring characteristics across different covers to identify broader visual conventions. I propose those mapped conventions as a foundation for digital typeface design. Rather than digitizing a single archival model, the project consolidates recurring features into contemporary typographic system. This methodology creates a workflow in which archival book covers became a lens through which the broader reality of historical design practice can be reconstructed. Literature, production materials, and interviews with designers active in the period provide the wider context needed to understand technical limitations, institutional workflows, and economic realities. This allows contemporary design decisions to be grounded in historical knowledge rather than purely visual inspiration. The post-war period saw the widespread circulation of instructional workbooks on lettering, many of which were regularly reprinted in large quantities. This publication promoted practical methods for constructing letter forms and served as accessible guides for signmakers, craftsmen, and general public. They represented an important continuation of pre-war tradition, emphasizing order, legibility, and formal consistency. However, interviews with Professor Ludwik Żelaźniewicz and Professor Jan Jaromir Aleksiun, both active as designers since the late 60s, suggest that these manuals played only a marginal role in professional design education. In their recollections, such materials were considered external to the emerging academic model of graphic design, which was increasingly shaped within artistic rather than technical curricula. This distinction reveals an important multitude in the culture of lettering. On one side stood the practical tradition rooted in craft, standardization, and reproducible construction. On the other stood a more experimental and expressive approach cultivated in art academies, where lettering became a tool for visual interpretation rather than formal instruction. Educated designers were primarily interested in contemporary Western references, particularly high-quality typefaces. In a country with closed borders, Western visual culture carried strong aspirational value, including typography. At the same time, their training emphasized the use of artistic expression to evoke conceptual depth through letter forms. This approach closely parallels the treatment of lettering in the Polish school of poster, where typographic form often functioned as painterly and metaphorically extension of the image. By the late 60s, this expressive orientation increasingly dominated more traditional exercise-based writing Roman capitals with broad-nib pens or sticks. Methods originally focused on the structural logic of letter construction. Instead, designers were trained to translate themes, emotions, or ideas into letter forms. This educational shift had lasting consequences for professional practice. In a context where access to contemporary typographic resources was limited, the ability to construct and manipulate letter forms independently became an essential skill. It allowed designers to respond creatively to shortages while drawing on a deeply internalized vocabulary of formal expression. Seen in this light, design education did not simply teach lettering as a technical skill, it cultivated it as a mode of interpretation. The coexistence of these two traditions helps explain the diversity of lettering practices visible in Polish graphic design of the communist period. Regardless of the creative motivations, the technique stayed uniform when preparing design for print. Letter shapes were made using the Redis pen and black ink. It is worth remembering that the permanent markers and pens were not really widely available, so the Redis pen was in use beyond calligraphy, for making the precision outlines of shapes later filled with ink. Designers often had around 1 month to develop a book cover. At this stage, typography was frequently indicated only provisionally. Markings for titles, paragraphs, and text hierarchy served primarily as a compositional guides, helping establish the overall structure of the cover and suggesting possible directions for the later typographic decisions. A recurring characteristic of communist-era lettering is an economy of form. Rather than drawing every letter independently, designers frequently relied on strategies of reuse, adaptation, and modification of archival examples reveal recurring shapes, curves, terminals, and structural elements being repeated across multiple characters, reducing drawing effort while maintaining visual consistency. Designers worked with a variety of typographic references, including dry transfer sheets, type specimen books, imported magazines, and previously completed projects. These sources were frequently incomplete and difficult to obtain, encouraging their construction and adaptation of existing forms rather than their direct reproduction. The reuse of shapes did not necessarily lead to rigidity. On the contrary, designers often adjusted recurring elements to suit specific contexts. A curve, terminal, or stroke could be modified to improve rhythm, spacing, or the visual balance of a particular word. The process therefore combines standardization with flexibility, allowing efficient production while preserving expressive qualities. This suggests that lettering was sometimes approached accordingly to principles associated with typography. Rather than treating each character as a unique drawing, designers developed reusable system of forms capable of generating multiple letters. The resulting work occupies an intermediate position between bespoke lettering and type design, aesthetically falling between traditional distinction between the two disciplines. After submission, the design passed through technical editors and production specialists. Their role extended beyond typesetting the book content. They frequently adjusted cover typography for the secondary information, substituted with available typefaces, and sometimes redraw lettering entirely. This reveals that the designer rarely retained full control over the final printed artifact. Several interview accounts reinforce this interpretation. Jan Bokiewicz described instances in which cover was submitted as a production drawing and later redrawn by technical staff within the publishing house. In such cases, the designer's work functioned less as a finished artifact and more as a set of instructions for further interpretation. The final form emerged through a process of adaptation, refinement, and technical mediation. From a contemporary perspective, this process differs significantly from the digital what you see is what you get workflows, where the designer's file is usually identical to the final product. The historical process was characterized by translation and collective interpretation, involving multiple actors whose contributions often remained invisible in the historical record. So far, this work has clarified that communist-era shortages did not just limit graphic design but actively channeled it, turning book cover lettering into a space where constraints, production habits, and individual decisions crystallized into recognizable visual patterns that can be described and used as design-relevant knowledge. Documenting lettering as a systematic practice uncovers an essential and overlooked chapter in the history of writing and its entanglements. Thank you very much. And maybe I will stop sharing so I can hear you and see you. Thank you.
Radek, thank you very much. I will first open the floor to any questions. While people are starting ahead, I've got one. You showed some very interesting evidence, primary evidence from lettering drawings, Bokiewicz's lettering that, and you made the point that this was not a specification for a final thing, but it was often then interpreted by others. The archives that you're looking at, do they also have any records of correspondence? Are these things that exist on their own, or are they also accompanied by, I don't know, a letter that says, do this to that thing? Or I didn't like what you did last time, do this. Are there any words accompanying these things?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And from what I found so far, I couldn't find any documents. We have a pretty good archive here locally. but usually if they have official records, it's mostly for the, let's say, artwork itself or materials that were used for creating this artwork. With the documents, I couldn't find anything so far. However, this is something super interesting, and also that's why I decided to use the interviews to maybe somehow extract this information in a different way. Yeah, but the process, I think to your point, the process wasn't like fully transparent. They usually gave the materials to the printers with the notes, and that was pretty much it. Sometimes when they had like better connection with the printer, but the printing industry was also very highly controlled by the state, because no one wanted to let people mess with printers or have access to printers. That was quite rare and quite limited. And usually what I've heard from the designers, they also like rarely have the production materials themselves. They've been handing them, and that was it. They never got it back. And yeah, sometimes even I've heard about the cases where they passed everything to the production and the censorship banned it, but for some reason it was still printed the whole volume, but it was never published. So yeah, it were quite interesting times in that state.
Any questions?
Can I ask?
Adam, please.
Thank you. So I remember some of the covers that you've talked about growing up in Poland at the time. However, my question is, to what extent typography that you are talking about was, maybe you mentioned that, but I didn't hear. How was it related beyond book cover design? There were also LP sleeves, and there were posters like the ones that are some of which represented by the poster behind you. It feels like there was a kind of universe of typography, not only limited to, or is it just a practical narrowing down of your field or your interest?
It's a good question. I think probably it would require a really like a good conversation actually to answer, but if I understand correctly, and I can briefly answer, I think it was very much based on the impression of type, because the resources that they really were into looking at anything related with the Western culture, typography included. So you couldn't really get too much of music from the Western culture, like magazines. People smuggled it, and they tried to like get the impression of how it looks, and they were trying to reconstruct it. And lots of it happens in, like, for example, the Polish school of poster. And it was similar case with the lettering on book covers. Usually it was like same designers were doing like covers, book covers, posters. Usually those were the main two fields for professional work. So yeah, it was like impression based. So it's kind of quite interesting that they developed the ways of working where they could fill the blanks, and they had some input, and through their process they could get something out that was kind of resembling the typefaces that we're using, but at the same time it was something like completely new.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
Any more questions? Yeah, please, Vishal.
I had once attended a lecture by Lech Majewski, and he was talking about how, and I don't know if this is related to your research, but how some of the posters for the circuses would actually use various symbols which were subversive and hidden, and they would get away with that. The censorship would not catch it. Is that something you're looking at in book covers or in other spheres, or is it only limited to posters? And want to talk about it? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's actually also a very interesting case, because on one hand, the censorship was really hard in using some very readable symbols, like, for example, religious symbols. So there is this whole series of, you can find like some good examples where with lettering, designers were tried to kind of smuggle the religious symbols in the letter shapes, like the very exaggerated lowercase t or something like this. Like you can kind of read it, but officially, you know, it's not a cross. But on the other hand, something I mentioned, some sectors were kind of treated more loosely, like especially circus. Some of the cultural sectors, like theater, cinema, usually if something was already, you know, allowed for the distribution, they kind of didn't really saw it as a threat, because it was like the content was already accepted, so the interpretation should be kind of safe. So, you know, it wasn't really uniform. Book publishing for me is interesting because it's like connected to like a bigger industry of printing and, like, you know, censorship that was really involved in that. So yeah, and I think from what you mentioned, really created this space where poster, for example, could really like accelerate, because it was mostly dealing with those, you know, cultural teams. I hope that answers the question.
I'm conscious of the time, Radek. Lovely to see you. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Likewise.